Morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Phil. What I'd like to do in the next 25 minutes is talk about the 70-20-10 model at work. I decided I'd use this image because today's Australia Day, and it's been, those of you that know me and those of you that don't will pick in my accent that there's a bit of Antipodean in there, and it's been a pretty tough time for Australians over the last couple of months, really. There's been a bit of water sloshing around, but the most important problem and challenge we've had is England has beaten us in one half of a cricket match in the Ashes. But I'm really pleased to see that yesterday the Australian women beat the England women team in the Ashes. So I'd call that 1-1, I think. Right. So I think what Roger Schank talked about this morning and his approach, I think, resonates very, very much with what I'm going to say, and I'm sure resonates with what a lot of people will be talking about over the next 2 days. But as I start to burrow into this 70-20-10 model, which I'm sure many of you will know a little about, some may know quite a lot about, and I want to talk through and give some examples of where it's helping organisations, I'd just like to ask a couple of questions, and I think Roger almost asked these questions earlier on. Just think about one great learning experience that you've had. It might be when you learned to ride a tricycle, or it might be when you learned algebra. I didn't know what Roger was going to talk about this morning, but it might be something like this. And if you think back about those learning experiences, those aha moments, I'd put my money on the fact that those experiences didn't occur in a formal structured learning environment. They may have been triggered by a formal structured learning environment, but they might more likely to occur at the point when you are actually using them. Or maybe relate to this process. The well-known Ebbinghaus, Hermann Ebbinghaus, 1885, did his work on how much people remember without context. And that without context is really important. And Ebbinghaus determined that humans will remember about or forget about half of what they've been told if they don't have context within an hour of being told it. Maybe you remember something like this. Maybe you've had this experience where you've learned something, you then think you've forgotten it, except you've had some practice, and up it's come again. Or maybe even this. And if any of you are musicians, for example, and I know from my own experience in playing music for years and years, if you don't practice, first of all, you don't get better, and if you don't practice, you don't stay good. And certainly from my experience, I can tell you I was a semi-professional musician when I was in my 20s. I can still play, but nowhere near the way I could then. The reason is because I don't practice. So basically, I think the 70-20-10 model is very much focused around experiential learning, which Sarah's going to pick up and speak about, some specific cases, but experiential learning and about the importance of practice. And I want to talk about the learning landscape and what I call learnscapes, which again Sarah will expand on in great deal, and what I call workscapes, because learning and work really need to be thought about in the same breath, and we need to think very closely about that. I first of all want to draw on some work and some models by Dr. Will Thalheimer, who's done a lot of thinking and a lot of work around what he calls the learning landscape. And Will divides the learning landscape up into 3 areas. There's training interventions, there's what he calls the performance situation, and then there are the learning or what he calls the learning outcomes, what I call the learning and performance outcomes. And there's plenty of research around that's either survey research or academic research or anecdotal evidence that tells us that around about 10 to 20% of those performance outcomes are driven through training interventions. Round about 70, 80, 90% are driven through the performance situation to get the full 100%. So the training situation is off-the-job learning, formal learning, which leads to on-the-job performance. On-the-job learning, in other words, workplace learning, leads to on-the-job performance. And there's 2 components to this. There's stuff we remember, and Roger spoke really eloquently, I thought, about the whole issue around remembering this morning. And there's the stuff that we need to be prompted on. And they lead finally to individual results and ultimately to organisational results. And again, Thalheimer has described this first bit, the learning, whether it's on the job or off the job, as a learning zone, the remembering prompting bit being the trigger zone. Again, Roger Jennings spoke about that this morning. The performance zone, where you're actually doing the stuff that you need to do, and the results zone. Nothing surprising to anyone, I guess, from there. I think there's some couple of key important elements here. The first is that remembering, in terms of the way that we do it, is retrieving information from long-term memory and putting it into working memory. It's often triggered by some external cue, but it's about getting that stuff into long-term memory, then getting it out into working memory and using it. And Ebbinghaus, showed that if you don't give context, you lose most of it, and it's an exponential loss. And so remembering is a bit of a challenge for us. And we remember the more frequently we use some process, some practice, some activity, the easier it is to move it from long-term memory into working memory. Whereas prompting misses out a step. It misses out the long-term memory. In fact, you can be prompted from external cue to go straight to working memory. So again, this comes back into the whole view around learning just in time when you need it rather just in case. Now, on-the-job learning through the formal route, this has been the learning and development's traditional path of greatest influence. We've taken people out of the work, whether that be to put them through an e-learning program or a formal course or whatever, and put them through the process to get the remembering process going and getting them into on-the-job performance. However, the point of greatest, or the path of greatest impact, is actually not where the path of the greatest influence has been in the past. Because on-the-job learning, close to the point of need, will give us the greatest impact. So that throws up a question for me around L&D's role, and particularly looking in the 70-20-10 model, when you're starting to move things into the workplace and trying to embed and support people in doing their jobs in the workplace, it raises the first question is, who's accountable, who's responsible for the various bits? And for me, the answer is, off-the-job learning, L&D has absolute accountability for doing that well, for doing it efficiently, and for making sure it's effective. When we get to all the other bits, it becomes a joint accountability. It's partly the accountability of the line manager, and it's partly L&D. And of course, it's obviously also the accountability and responsibility of the individual concerned. So that's just a little bit of context, and I think it's worthwhile thinking about 70-20-10 in that model. So basically, there's this awareness that most learning happens through experiences. And I think that's bubbled to the top. I think we've always known it. If you look back in most countries, the apprenticeship scheme has been in place since medieval times, has worked very well on the basis that you have a master, someone helps you, someone guides you through practice, and actually you learn to do what you need to do. And it was only through a couple of things. It was really 18th century Prussian models, which decided that a curriculum needed to be developed. We needed to structure learning. And as Roger said this morning, talked about the American experience with the experience in terms of developing the US school curriculum. I mean, we're really hostages to a certain extent, or have been hostages to some extent to those models. But the point is that in order to help people thrive in what we see as this new environment, and I'm sure all of us here, we're preaching to the choir to a certain extent, everyone realizes that things are changing. We actually need a framework for thinking outside courses, classes, and curricula. And that's where 70-20-10 has started to be used. It's used as a framework. And I've had innumerable conversations with people who've said, well, show me the evidence. I don't believe it. I can't see the hard data. Where is it 70-20-10? And the answer is, in your own context, it may not be 70-20-10. It mightn't be that 70% of the learning is experiential learning through practice and experiences, and that 20% is through other people through conversations, through networking, through coaching, through mentoring, and the 10% is formal. It may be that if you're working in a particular vertical, a particular industry, it might be skewed one way or it might be skewed the other. And sometimes it's surprising, it's not what you'd initially think. I did some work last year in a company in Ireland, which was a manufacturing company, manufacturing components for dashboards for cars. And I went in thinking, well, here we'll have quite a lot of formal structured learning as people go out the factory floor, not a bit of it. Their model was almost 90% learning in the workplace. And a little bit of compliance and stuff, that process that they had to get through was done formally out of the work. So 70-20-10 is come out of that, and I'll talk a little bit about where it's come from and organisations that are using it. And the term I like to use, and my colleagues, Phil mentioned I work with some colleagues in the Internet Time Alliance, and we have a book published called Working Smarter. And I see Working Smarter and 70-20-10 as being sort of meshed approaches. And they're approaches to address a set of proven facts. And the proven facts are this. People learn more about their work informally than they do formally, whether it's 70%, whether it's 80, 90, 50, 50, 55, 60, whatever. We learn more about our work by doing it than we do talking about it or learning about it formally outside the workplace. That novices, people who are new to a role, new to an organisation, will learn more, a greater proportion formally than they will informally. And that then focuses into things such as really good induction programs, making sure that they're not so detailed that you're trying to fill heads with knowledge that they're never going to use, but really getting them to understand the context of their new role, context of their new job, their new organisation, and making sure that that's it. Whereas veterans, and I'll show you a little bit of data here, veterans rely more on informal learning than formal learning. You'd expect someone who's been in a role, who's an expert, who's been in a role for a long time, or who's a senior leader and been in the organisation for a long time, to be engaged in formal learning less than a novice would. The formal learning works best with explicit, where you can actually describe the processes and have explicit clarity around the steps and so on, and there is one answer when there's best practice, or there's a number of correct answers where there's good practice. They work better with formal learning tends to work better with that. But for most people working in the knowledge industries, most people working really in the 21st century, a large percentage of us will be working where there's a lot of tacit information and there's a lot of tacit knowledge required, and we're making decisions, and every situation we come up against is going to be slightly different to previous situation. Informal learning works best with that. So let me talk about the model. As I said earlier on, I break it down in terms of 70 being learning and developing through experience, 20 through others, and 10 through structured courses and programs, which means that 90% is through experiential learning. So when we think about how we're facilitating and supporting people, we need to think about the rich experiences that we're providing. Secondarily, it's a model. It's based on empirical research and experience. It's a reference model, it's not a recipe. I actually have diminishing amount of time for the discussions with usually academics who are saying, well, show me the research on this that actually demonstrates that this is the breakdown. Because the answer is any piece of research will show it slightly differently. It's a bit like going back to Freudian analysis and asking to get the research on Freudian analysis. The answer is we're dealing with people here. We're not dealing with something which is we're not dealing with chemicals or something. It's a slightly different process, a more complex process. There is, however, quite a lot of evidence around 70-20-10. I'd refer you to my colleague in Internet Time Alliance, Jay Cross. In his informal learning book, at the back of the book, he cited some instances of pieces of research or survey which had indicated these sorts of figures. And there's quite a lot more here. I've just pulled out some of these. Lowenstein and Splitzer, people learn about 70% of what they know to do their jobs. They learn informally. Peter Henschel from the Institute of Research on Learning, 80% more corporate learning is found to be informal, and so on and so forth. There's quite a lot of this, these sort of surveys and this sort of evidence around. However, if we go back further, And it's not a new idea. I've been working with the people at Deakin University in Australia, their Deakin Prime, which is their corporate education part of the university. They've got a group of researchers researching 70-20-10. They've been trying to track back and see where this model came from. And I think we've nailed it back to Alan Tuff was probably one of the first people to come up with it. And I'm sure Alan Tuff would be very pleased seeing this photograph of himself, born 1936. He's now retired, emeritus professor, University of Toronto. I was having an exchange with him, an email exchange with him just a month or so ago, and he said, yep, 70-20-10 appeared in all the research we did, or in the research we did, actually in this adults learning projects, 1971, but actually back earlier, 67, when he was researching. That rough breakdown came out. He found that about 70% of all learning projects are planned by the learner, so the whole model there, and also even not just adult learning, but when they looked at school kids, they found that a lot of their out-of-school learning was extensive as well. And Alan Tuff, I think, is usually credited with the implementation of this model at Princeton University, something called the Princeton Learning Model it's called now. Actually, I think it was Alan Tuff whose research sort of drove that through, and it really was Alan's work rather than anything else. Then 25 years later, Morgan McCall and his colleagues at the Center for Creative Leadership in North Carolina did some research and published a book. 1996, they published the Career Architect Development Planner that again brought out some research on 70-20-10. You can still get this book, you can get it on Amazon. However, I have to give you a health warning. I think it sells at about £150, if not more. But and there's only a little bit about 70-20-10 in it. And here's the nub of it, I guess. What Lombardo and Eichener, working with Morgan McCall, said was that successful and effective managers, the lessons they learn is basically 70% from tough jobs, 20% from people, mostly the boss, incidentally, and 10% from courses and reading. So that's just a little bit of background. This is a list that I updated a couple of weeks ago of organisations that the folks at Deakin and that I've identified who not are thinking about using it, but who've actually implemented and are embedding 70-20-10 model in their operations. So if you look at these many well-known logos and names, and you'll see that they're not just in one sector, they're actually right across the board. So you've got lots of financial organisations, tech organisations, consultancy organisations, consumer product organisations, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of organisations actually starting to embed this model. Another bit of research which I could point you to, which I think is well worth reading, is it's available on the web. Peter Casebow and his colleagues at Good Practice, an organisation based in Edinburgh, did some research last year, about a year ago, and they looked at 287 managers and asked them questions about how they learned. And these are the figures that they produced. These managers, this sample of managers, most of them found that they learned through informal chats with colleagues. They also learned through going and finding the stuff, searching for the stuff, through trial and error, and through on-the-job instruction, coaching, support from a colleague or a manager. And interestingly, in this research that Peter carried out, though the informal chats and the on-the-job instruction were also seen as being the most effective. So not only the most frequent, but the most effective. Look for where are the courses, where's the formal instruction here. It's actually somewhere down, I guess, somewhere down here. So just looking at the sorts of typical activities that one would expect to see around, if you're thinking about, okay, I want to implement this, where do I start? And the answer is you step back and you think about what sort of things can we help or provide for people to help them develop. And in that 70 bucket, that 70% area, you've got things such as creating opportunities to apply new learning and skills in real situations, creating opportunities to reflect and learn from project, providing assignments focused on new initiatives, the chance to work as a member of a small team, and so on and so forth, down through here. If you think about those, And if you work in the learning and development department, you'll look at that and say, well, how in the hell can I do any of that? Because if I want to provide opportunities to apply new learning and skills to real situations, I might be able to help by embedding that in some sort of formal learning, or I might be able to help in some way. But what about assignments focused on new initiatives? I have no accountability or no ability to make that happen. And the answer, as soon as you start looking at this model, becomes clearly that you must work closely with line managers. Line managers need to become your best friends. You need to become a trusted advisor, and you need to be able to influence them. Because without that, you can't do any of that 70-bit, or you can do very little of that 70-bit. What about the 20? Well, once you look at this as well, you see that things such as formal, informal mentoring. I can't say I've ever known of a learning and development person who's individually, without input from the manager, who set up a mentoring environment or program or opportunity for people. So again, it's about engaging with managers. Things like informal feedback and work debriefs. I suppose we could take managers off and give them some formal training on how to provide feedback and how to debrief and so on. But actually, it means that we need to tie in closely. So there's a range of things that we can do, a few things we can do individually, but actually we need to work closely. L&D people need to work very closely with their managers. The 10, we've got nailed. Okay, structured induction onboarding, activity-based workshops, immersive interactive e-learning, all this simulation, game-based structured development, all sorts of stuff. That's stuff that we can do. 70-20-10 doesn't say you need to stop doing that. It says you need to make sure that it runs efficiently and effectively and actually has impact, but don't think about it all the time and don't put even the majority of your efforts into it. So I'll just talk about quickly about some examples. Here's an example where an academic institution is using 70-20-10 to build the model inside the 10. It's almost like Russian dolls. You take the 10 and you put the 70-20-10 inside that. I'd call this an evolutionary approach. I think it's helpful, but I think actually one needs to think outside of that to really have impact. So, for example, with BAE Systems, Cranfield and BAE Systems have constructed their commercial leadership program. And within that leadership program, they've broken down the activities and the outputs and everything that goes on in that into a very clear 70-20-10 model. And you can see there a quote from Bill Shedden at Cranfield who said, we're actually getting lots of organisations coming to us now saying, can you work more with this? So I think that we're seeing that happen. We're seeing this model getting built into formal programs. Then outside of that evolutionary process, we're seeing totally different, revolutionary type processes. And I think this is a good example. This is the first one I came across back in 2003, so 9 years ago. Goldman Sachs, they set up their Pine Street leadership organisation, and they implemented this model called reverse engineering leadership development process. So they took senior leaders, they selected role models in the senior leadership based on their own line manager input. Role models of people who are high performers, who are exemplifying good practice, best practice, whatever. And they asked them this question, reflecting over the course of your career, what would you say have been the most meaningful sources of your development? And not surprisingly, the outputs were on-the-job experiences, support from my own manager, development of an informal mentor network, and formal education training. So they were those things. What Goldman Sachs then did was made sure that their own development approach reflected that actuality. So they developed what they call experience-oriented IDPs, or PDPs, or whatever you want to call it. They call them IDPs, so templates. So that within looking at the development needs as part of the standard process, and we did this at Reuters as well, there were job-based assignments. When we're looking at development activities, we want 70% to be around job-based assignments, 20% to be around relationships, and 10% around formal training. So very practical sort of approach of implementing the model. We did almost identically at Reuters. We looked at, like many organisations, Reuters and Thomson Reuters now, the two organisations that come together, have a model of job families, job roles. Within each job role, or across the organisation, there are competency frameworks, and then within each job role, there are general skills and professional skills. We looked at those skills levels, and we applied the 70-20-10 model. And we did it here. This is just a screen grab of a typical one of the skills. This skill happens to be for managers. It's around the developing employee skills, and we built our structure around the 70-20-10. So these are the sorts of things that you can do on the job, coaching, formal learning. If you hit the formal learning here, it went away and picked up a module or a bit of structured learning content and delivered it to you through an LMS. And exactly the same way that Goldman Sachs had worked, we also took performance reviews and broke them down into 70-20-10. Development objectives as part of the performance reviews, broke them down into 70-20-10 model. That's really simple. That's I think very practical. Critical success factors. Appreciation that workforce development is actually too important to be left to HR and L&D departments. We absolutely have to work with line managers. And that understanding that managers are critical for workers' performance improvement is totally critical. That requires a whole pile of behaviour change and different approaches and so on. And 70-20-10 is just a good model for helping that happen. And lastly, the need of a strategy and a governance model that supports learning beyond the classroom. And from my experience, organisations that have established particularly a governance model so that they can drive the changes through senior leaders in the organisation, through some sort of governance board or governance council or some structure, whatever one wants to call it, are those that are effective. Those that try and do it from the bottom up actually find that they're hitting their heads against a brick wall, and there's a lot of effort goes into it, and usually a lot of disappointment. Is HR and L&D ready? Well, I think there are big changes. We need to move from being content designers, developers, deliverers, and having this focus on content, to managing what I call workscapes. How do we work and help and enable people to have the experiences and to learn from the experiences and to reflect on the experiences they've had. We need to move from course-centric to performance-centric, from learning-focused to performance and productivity-focused. So that's me done.
Thank you, Charles.
With a bit of a rush through.
An immaculate timing. I'm sure you'll